Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are witnessing a geopolitical earthquake that could change the course of the Ukraine war and reshape the balance of power in Eastern Europe forever. Belarus, long considered one of Russia's most loyal allies, has turned against Moscow in a stunning and unexpected move. What once seemed unthinkable is now reality. The government and sections of the Belarusian military have shifted their stance, breaking decades of dependence on the Kremlin. This development could alter not just the fate of Belarus, but the entire trajectory of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. For nearly 30 years, Belarus under Alexander Lukashenko has been seen as a reliable extension of Russian influence. The two nations shared military bases, intelligence networks, and deep economic ties. Lukashenko often positioned himself as a loyal partner to Moscow while using that alliance to strengthen his own power at home. But as Russia's invasion of Ukraine dragged on, with massive losses and growing global isolation, cracks began to appear in that alliance. Behind the official smiles and handshakes, Belarusian officials, generals, and even ordinary citizens were increasingly uneasy about being dragged into a war they never supported. The breaking point came after months of silent frustration within Belarus's political and military elite. Russian troops had been stationed on Belarusian soil since early 2022, using the country as a launchpad for assaults into northern Ukraine. Many Belarusians viewed this as an occupation in all but name. The promise that Russia would protect Belarusian sovereignty had turned into a situation where Belarus was being used as a pawn in someone else's war. Local commanders began to push back against Moscow's directives, and for the first time, Belarusian officials refused to allow Russian forces unrestricted access to their bases. Reports began to leak from Minsk suggesting that Lukashenko's government was secretly opening back-channel communications with Ukraine and even some Western nations. These talks, though denied publicly, indicated a dramatic shift in policy, a realization that Russia's war was failing and that Belarus needed to secure its own survival. When news broke that Belarusian defense leaders had met with representatives from the European Union and discussed possible security guarantees independent of Moscow, the world knew something had changed. But this wasn't just a diplomatic shift. It was also a military one. In a move that shocked observers, several Belarusian military units refused to cooperate with Russian commands. These units had been tasked with supporting logistics for Russia's operations near the northern border of Ukraine. Instead, they declared that Belarus would no longer be a staging ground for Russian attacks. Satellite images soon showed Russian convoys withdrawing from Belarusian territory. Then, Lukashenko made a rare televised address that sent shockwaves through the Kremlin. He announced that Belarus would remain neutral in the war and that foreign forces operating without direct Belarusian approval must leave our soil. In diplomatic language, that was a declaration of defiance. Putin's reaction was immediate and furious. The Kremlin accused Western intelligence of orchestrating a coup within Belarus, calling Lukashenko's statements a betrayal of brotherhood. Russian media went into overdrive, denouncing Belarusian leaders as traitors and warning of serious consequences. Yet despite the threats, Minsk didn't back down. Instead, Belarusian authorities began tightening control over Russian assets in their territory, seizing supply depots, restricting communication lines, and monitoring Russian officers who remained. What started as political tension had escalated into a full-blown rift. Inside Belarus, the public response was explosive. For years, many Belarusians had quietly opposed their country's support for Moscow's war, fearing it would make them a target for Western sanctions or even military retaliation. Now, crowds poured into the streets waving the white-red-white flag, a banned symbol of Belarusian independence. For the first time since the protests of 2020, the streets of Minsk were filled not with fear, but with pride. Chants of no war and Belarus for peace echoed through the capital. Soldiers who once served alongside Russian troops began to pull back, focusing instead on defending Belarus's borders from any potential retaliation. Meanwhile, the move sent shockwaves through the battlefield in Ukraine. For over 2 years, Russia had relied heavily on Belarusian territory to launch missile attacks and supply lines. Now those strategic routes were cut off. Russian forces stationed in northern Ukraine suddenly faced logistical collapse. Ukrainian analysts described the development as a strategic miracle. Without Belarusian cooperation, Russia's northern front became vulnerable, forcing the Kremlin to redeploy troops from eastern Ukraine to guard its own border. This gave Ukrainian forces a critical advantage, allowing them to focus more resources on counteroffensives in Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia. Behind the scenes, Western diplomats were quick to seize the opportunity. Reports from Brussels and Washington confirmed that new talks were underway to normalize relations with Belarus. Economic aid, energy deals, and even potential security guarantees were being discussed. For Lukashenko, who had been under crushing sanctions and political isolation for years, this was an irresistible offer. Aligning with the West, or at least distancing from Moscow, could give him the political breathing room he desperately needed. It was a dangerous gamble, but one that seemed to pay off, at least for now. Russia, however, wasn't going to take this humiliation lightly. Russian state television accused NATO of corrupting Belarus, while military analysts warned that Moscow might consider direct intervention. But Putin's army was stretched thin. Between defending against Ukrainian offensives and managing internal instability, Russia lacked the strength to open a new front. Some reports even suggested that Russian intelligence operatives inside Belarus had been arrested or expelled, further straining relations between the two states. In this geopolitical storm, Belarus's sudden pivot carries enormous implications. By stepping away from Moscow, Belarus has not only reclaimed a measure of its independence, but also altered the strategic map of the Ukraine war. With the northern front neutralized, Russia loses a vital corridor. More importantly, this move signals to other Moscow-aligned nations, like Kazakhstan, Armenia, and even Serbia, that loyalty to Russia is no longer a guarantee of stability. The Kremlin's aura of control is cracking, and Belarus may have just delivered one of the biggest blows yet. For Ukraine, this shift is more than symbolic. It could mean fewer missile attacks from the north, less logistical pressure, and potentially a faster road to victory. It also opens the possibility of future cooperation between Kyiv and Minsk, something that seemed impossible just months ago. Ukrainian officials cautiously welcomed Belarus's new stance, saying they were ready to build bridges with any nation that respects sovereignty and peace. Still, the future remains uncertain. Lukashenko is walking a razor's edge. If Belarus drifts too far from Moscow, Putin could attempt to destabilize the country from within. Russian loyalists in the security services or political elite could stage sabotage or even a coup. On the other hand, if Lukashenko fails to deliver real independence, the Belarusian public, already energized by this new sense of freedom, could rise against him again. The next few months will determine whether this is a genuine break from Russia or a temporary act of survival. What's happening in Belarus is not just a shift in alliances, it's a turning point in the modern history of Eastern Europe. A country long seen as a satellite of Moscow is rediscovering its national identity. Its decision to stand apart could accelerate the decline of Russian influence across the region. This is not just about borders or politics. It's about a nation reclaiming its voice after decades of being silenced. As we watch this dramatic chapter unfold, one thing is certain: the map of Europe is changing before our eyes. Belarus turning against Russia is more than a diplomatic crisis. It's a symbol of how fast the old order is collapsing. The Ukraine war, which once looked like a test of strength between two nations, is now reshaping the alliances and identities of an entire region. History is being written in real time, and Belarus has just become one of its most unexpected authors. The move that Belarus has made could indeed change the Ukraine war forever. By breaking from Moscow's shadow, it has not only weakened Russia's hand, but inspired others to rethink where true power and freedom lie. The world will be watching closely, because what happens next in Minsk could decide the future of Europe, and possibly the fate of Vladimir Putin's empire itself.